Okay, welcome back to Canon Law in Exile. This is video number 4, and we're still in Lesson 6 on penal law. This video is going to be on particular crimes and particular penalties. So here we've touched on this already, but we're going to look at particular crimes or delicts and the specific penalties that are applied that correspond in the law. For the most part, we're going to be talking about the code of canon law itself. But keep in mind this document that we've referred to already that we will call SST, Sacramentorum Sanctitatis Tutela, protection of the holiness of the sacraments, or SST is what we'll call it. That was a 2001 motu proprio by John Paul II. He would revise it in 2003, and then Pope Benedict would revise it in 2010. It has to do with what are called grave delicts, or graviora delicta, or very serious crimes. It has to do with 7 particular crimes, primarily crimes against the sacraments, and then in addition, the crime of sexual abuse of a minor. It's most well known for that last one, the abuse of a minor. So a couple of things to know. We're going to have probably a separate video on SST. So this video will not primarily be about SST, but what you need to know is that some of the penalties that are provided in the code, they've been changed by SST. The main thing that has been changed is that a couple of the penalties that were not initially reserved to the Holy See now have been reserved to the Holy See in SST. So I will probably mention those as we go today, but the next time, our next video will talk specifically about SST, and we'll talk more about that in addition to other provisions of SST. Okay, so for the most part now we're talking about the code. One thing to keep in mind is that from the 1917 code to the current code, the number of particular crimes was reduced from 101 to 36. So we've talked about penal law becoming less important with the new code, with the post-Vatican II period. And you kind of see it there just in looking at the number of delicts or crimes which are listed there. Okay, or which are contained in the code. Okay, if you look at Woodall, and we're starting on page 484 of Woodall, he breaks down the different delicts into kind of categories, and I think these categories are pretty helpful. For most of the crimes, if that's not already apparent, I will describe what they are, and then discuss the penalty and tell you which penalties you should know. There's a few that you should know the penalty kind of off the top of your head, and we'll discuss why when we get to those penalties. Okay, our first grouping of penalties are called offenses against religion and against the unity of the church. The first delict is apostasy, heresy, and schism. These are 3 separate things, but they're very often grouped together. You can find a definition of them in Canon 751. Basically, heresy is denying something that belongs to the deposit of faith. Apostasy is the total repudiation of the faith, and schism is withholding communion from the Holy Father or those in communion with him. And the penalty, as you probably know, is a late sententiae excommunication. Though, as we discussed in the last video, it is that excommunication is not reserved to the Holy See. Okay, our next, and the penalty canon for apostasy, heresy, and schism is Canon 1364. So the definition is in Canon 751. The penalty is established in Canon 1364. Our next delict, prohibited religious rites, and this is Canon 1365. This basically primarily means a priest concelebrating the Mass with a minister who lacks full communion with the church, and the penalty specified there is a just penalty. Now that is altered somewhat with SST. The code did not reserve that penalty to the Holy See, but what SST does is it says if you celebrate the sacrament, if you celebrate essentially the Eucharist with a minister whose church or whose communion does not have apostolic succession, and does not have the sacramental priesthood, then in that instance, so basically if you concelebrate with a Protestant, then that delict is reserved to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. When we talk about SST, we're talking about the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which of course is part of the Holy See, but the delicts that are discussed in SST, they will be reserved to the CDF, Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, formerly known as the Holy Office. Okay, so prohibited concelebration, if you concelebrate with an Orthodox priest, it's still forbidden. There's a just penalty. But if you concelebrate with a Protestant, it is reserved to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Okay. Canon 1366. This is a penalty. This is kind of a rare penalty that applies just to laity. As we've discussed, most penalties apply to clergy. Canon 1366 is for parents who turn their children over for baptism in a non-Catholic church or who bring them up as non-Catholics. And the penalty is a just penalty, so a penalty according to the gravity of the circumstances. Okay, Canon 1367. This is what we would call desecration of the Eucharist. Though if you look in the code, all that is talked about is throwing away the sacred species. And this is a latae sententiae excommunication. But with SST, it not only is a latae sententiae excommunication, but it's reserved to the CDF with SST. And PSILT, the Pontifical Council for Legislative Texts, clarified that it's not only throwing away the sacred species, which is the crime, but any profanation, any sacrilege, any desecration of the host is falls under this canon, even though you might not be throwing it away. For instance, if you stomped on the host, you wouldn't be throwing it away, but obviously you're showing contempt. So PSILT answered that question and said, yes, you would have incurred the penalty, even if you didn't throw it away, but you profaned the Eucharist in a different way. Okay, that's the end of our first category of penalties. The next category is offenses against the freedom of the church. And we start in Canon 1370 with physical attacks on several people. We've discussed these already. If you physically attack the Pope, the penalty is a latae sententiae excommunication reserved to the Holy See. If you physically attack a bishop, the penalty is a latae sententiae interdict. And if the offender is a cleric, also a latae sententiae suspension. If you physically attack a cleric or religious, the penalty is a just penalty, but assault on a cleric or religious is a crime only if it is done with contempt of the faith or contempt of the church, or contempt of church authority. So of those three, only the first one, attack on the Pope, is reserved to the Holy See. Okay, Canon 1371, teaching a doctrine condemned by the Pope or an ecumenical council, or obstinately rejecting authentic teaching. This corresponds to Canon 752, where authentic teaching is described, and the penalty is a just penalty. That's Canon 1371. Many of the crimes, the penalty will be a just, J-U-S-T, penalty, and that just signifies that the penalty is indeterminate. It's going to be judged on the basis of how serious your crime was, how great your fault was, etc. Okay, that's the end of our next category. I'm going to skip a couple of crimes that seem rare. For instance, I'll tell you what I'm skipping right now. Canon 1372, appealing from the Roman pontiff to an ecumenical council. As you know, this is the problem of conciliarism, treating a council as superior to the Pope. And the crime there is an unspecified censure, so it's some type of censure. This just isn't something that we hear of. This is really more of a historical difficulty, so I doubt anyone, at least under the 1983 code, has ever actually been penalized for it. So for something like that that's not really of current practical interest to us, I may not mention it. You'll see it in Woodall, etc., but we just may not discuss it necessarily in these videos. But we'll touch on most of the delicts. Okay, our next category: offenses of usurpation of office or abuse of office. Okay, this is important. The first one is attempting to absolve an accomplice. And when we say attempting to absolve an accomplice, we mean an accomplice in a sexual sin, or what the canon calls an accomplice in a sin against the sixth commandment. Another way to say against the sixth commandment that you'll see in canon law is contra sextum. If we say contra sextum, that means a sexual crime, or a sexual sin, a sexual offense, going against the sixth commandment. So this is the confessor has engaged in a sexual sin with someone, and then he attempts to absolve the other person of the sin that they've just committed together. Why do we say attempting? Because the absolution is invalid. If you look at Canon 977, you'll see that that absolution is invalid except in danger of death. So the crime here is the mere attempt to do the absolution, even though the absolution doesn't have effect. What's the penalty? Late sententiae excommunication. This is one where I think you should know the penalty. This is really an abuse of confession. Obviously, it's a sexual offense as well. A reason I think it's good to know the penalty is because it's such a really such a sacrilege of the person, of the priest, a sacrilege of the sacrament of confession itself, and it's good to know what the penalties are that correspond to sins against the sacrament of confession, because I think when you discuss them with the faithful, I think that gives the faithful confidence in the sacrament and confidence in their confessors when they hear how vigilant the church is to protect the sacrament, and to protect the secrecy of the sacrament. Why is this a late sententiae penalty? Here, even people who don't like late sententiae penalties, like myself, I'm not a very big fan of late sententiae penalties. Here, I think it's necessary because the crime will not come to light otherwise. It happens in the confessional, so no one knows about it other than the two people there. So you need a latae sententiae penalty, so the offender, when he feels guilt, will uh, he will realize that he's under the penalty. He should know it, of course, because he's a priest, and he will bring it to light when he seeks absolution himself. Um, if he could just go to confession himself, uh, like any other sin, this type of crime would never come to light. So here, I think it's very good that it's a latae sententiae penalty. Okay, next. Next delict, attempted celebration of the Eucharist, Canon 1378. The penalty is a latae sententiae interdict. This was not a reserved penalty under the code, but it now is a reserved penalty under SST. So now it's reserved to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, or the CDF. And the same is true of attempted absolution, attempting to give absolution in confession, Canon 1378. Again, the penalty, a latae sententiae interdict, not a reserved penalty under the code, but it is now reserved under SST. Recall, reserved means reserved to the Holy See, or specifically with SST, reserved to the CDF, the Holy Office, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Okay, our next offense or usurpation of office is simony, sort of attempting to purchase the sacraments or to celebrate the sacraments through simony. That's Canon 1380, and the penalty is interdict or suspension, but those are ferende sententiae penalties, not latae sententiae. So they have to be imposed by a judicial process or an administrative procedure. They do not come into effect automatically. Next penalty, or next crime, consecrating a bishop without a pontifical mandate. That's Canon 1382. The penalty is a latae sententiae excommunication. This is another one that you need to know. Why do you need to know it? You're not a bishop, you're not going to be consecrating anyone soon, and if you do, hopefully never without a mandate. It's important to know because we've had it fairly recently in our history. This happened in 1988 with the Society of St. Pius X. Archbishop Lefebvre consecrated 4 bishops without a pontifical mandate, and so he and his co-consecrating bishop were excommunicated. It's just important to know because it's 1988 may not seem recent to you. It's recent enough that there still are a lot of people who are affected by it. So you should know that. And this is a penalty that's reserved to the Holy See. Okay, next one, trafficking in mass offerings or mass stipends, and that's Canon 1385. When we say trafficking, now mass stipends are fine, mass offerings are fine to accept an offering as part of support of the clergy when you celebrate a mass for someone. Trafficking would mean that you're gathering mass stipends but not paying attention to whether the masses are actually said, or you're being extremely careless about that. So that is Canon 1385. The penalty is a censure or other just penalty. So a censure could be as high as excommunication, could be interdict, suspension, or it could be a different penalty. It says censure or other just penalty. So if there were less fault, maybe it would not be a censure, but would be something less. Okay, then we have some more crimes against the sacrament of confession. One is solicitation. Solicitation in the confessional. This is Canon 1387. What does solicitation means? That means essentially that the confessor is trying to get the penitent to engage in a sexual sin, either with himself or with another person. So again, really a real sacrilege against the sacrament. Um, this crime is punished with suspension, deprivation, or prohibition according to the gravity of the offense. So basically, suspension of the priest confessor. But it could even be in a even more serious case, be punished with dismissal from the clerical state. This is another one that is not reserved to the Holy See in the code, but under the more recent law, SST, it is reserved to the Holy See, specifically the CDF. Okay, that's solicitation. Our next crime against the sacrament of confession is direct violation of the seal. That's Canon 1388, and the penalty there is a latae sententiae, excommunication, and it is reserved to the Holy See. That one, direct violation of the seal, you need to know the penalty. You need to know that the penalty is latae sententiae, excommunication. Why? Because of what we were just discussing, people who are nervous about going to confession, they're nervous about the real secrecy of the confessional. This is something you can assure somebody with by saying, hey, look, this is how seriously the church takes this. If I hear your confession and then tell somebody about it, I'm excommunicated automatically myself. So this is important to know, or even if you're not a priest yourself, to assure other people of the seriousness with which the church treats the sacraments. I just said I called the crime direct violation of the seal. Direct means that you have revealed both the penitent and the sin. There's also a delict for indirect violation. Indirect violation is there's a lesser penalty. It's a just penalty, and that means you haven't directly revealed both the penitent and the sin, but you've revealed information where there's a risk that someone could connect the sin with this particular person. Interpreters also are subject to penalties, even up to excommunication, if they violate the seal or violate confidentiality. Okay, that's our next category is called offenses of falsehood, and the first one is false denunciation. False denunciation of a confessor. And this is Canon 1390. The penalty is a latae sententiae interdict. This means that we talked about solicitation in confession. This is where there wasn't really solicitation, but the penitent lied and was angry at the priest or something, so he or she accuses the priest of solicitation. This is an incredibly serious crime for a number of things. Again, it's a sacrilege against the sacrament of confession and against the priesthood, but also because the priest has great difficulty defending himself. This is another penalty where you need to know, another crime where you need to know the penalty, which is a latae sententiae interdict. Again, this is one of the crimes where even people who don't like latae sententiae penalties, they often will say, and I agree with this myself personally, that we need a latae sententiae penalty here because it's not enough for the person who falsely denounces the confessor just to go get absolved by another priest. They have to set things right again, and this penalty is what forces them to set things right. They don't. They're not. They're not absolved themselves unless they set things right, or they're absolved, but their absolution is conditional on their following through and clearing the name of the confessor who they have falsely denounced, probably denounced him to his bishop. They've made this false accusation. So very important canon here, Canon 1390, and you should know both the crime and the penalty. Okay, next category, Offenses against special obligations. Canon 1392 is a member of the clergy engaged in trade. This would probably have to be a priest or a bishop. It would not be unusual for a deacon to be engaged in trade. Trade, by trade we mean a business or commerce, and that's punished according to the gravity of the offense. A cleric attempting marriage, Canon 1394, punished with a latae sententiae suspension. Now, next one, a religious and perpetual vows attempting marriage, punished with a latae sententiae interdict, Canon 1394. Now think about those two last things. A cleric attempting marriage is punished with a latae sententiae suspension, and a religious and perpetual vows attempting marriage is punished with a latae sententiae interdict. So really the penalty is greater for the religious than it is for the clergy, though obviously some people are both clergy and religious. Why is the penalty greater? This is something I think we'll probably talk about next semester if we get to have our lesson on consecrated life, and it gives us a clue as to what consecrated life means when we look at these two penalties and see why it's a greater offense if you're a religious and perpetual vows who attempts marriage than even a member of the clergy attempting marriage. Okay, our next penalty, our next crime, member of the clergy who is in concubinage. What does that mean? It means he has a concubine or he is a concubine. Traditionally, we've usually thought of a concubine as a woman, a kept woman, but really either one is a concubine. The two are really each other's concubines in a sense. It doesn't necessarily have to be restricted to one sex or the other. So this is a cleric in concubinage. He's living with a woman, and the penalty there is suspension, and that canon is 1395. Now that same canon also applies to other sexual offenses, again, offenses against the sixth commandment or contra sextum, and the penalty applies to outward offenses against the sixth commandment if they're committed with force, with threats, in public, or with a minor below 18. So this is the canon, 1395, that outlaws sexual abuse of a minor. And the penalties are just penalties up to dismissal from the clerical state for these crimes. This was not a reserved penalty in the original code, but it now is reserved under SST. It's reserved to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Also in 2010, what was added to, again, added by SST, the new revision of SST in 2010, is pornographic images. If a cleric acquires, possesses, or distributes pornographic images of minors under age 14, he suffers the same penalty. Again, a just penalty, but it could be up to dismissal from the clerical state. This might be something that you might wish to write about in your thought piece on penal law, this particular edition. You may agree or you may disagree with it. Okay, offenses, next category, offenses against human liberty and life. Canon 1397 is about murder, abduction, imprisonment, mutilation, and grave injury, and these are punished according to the gravity of the offense. And several possible penalties are listed, but the canon refers back to Canon 1336. If you look at that canon, you'll see that it's much more geared to the clergy than to the laity. So even though it doesn't quite say it, Canon 1397 seems especially to be concerned with murder or abduction or imprisonment committed by a member of the clergy. Okay, Canon 1398, procuring a completed abortion. As you know, we talked about extensively in the last video, the penalty is a latae sententiae, excommunication. keep in mind that imputability has to be established, and those are those factors in Canon 1323. Some people get very offended when they hear that people with who have abortions are excommunicated. But as we've kind of referred to, not everyone is excommunicated. There's an age limit. If you're below 16, you cannot be subject to a penalty. And some females who have abortions are below 16. And and we also know that there's pressure involved a lot of the time with having an abortion. And also some women who have an abortion may not know of the sanction that the law provides there. So you can't say as a blanket statement that every woman or even every Catholic woman who has an abortion is excommunicated. You have to keep in mind those factors of imputability that we talked about. Let's see. I think that's probably the most important thing. Woodall says on 487 that for a penalty to apply, all of the conditions for mortal sin must be met. Personally, I would not entirely agree with that. I do agree that the penalties, the delicts, they presuppose sin, they presuppose serious sin, but you and we're certainly concerned with imputability, but I don't know that literally all of the requirements for mortal sin have to be met for a process to go forward. I think there's a lot of overlap there, but I think the main inquiry is imputability and has the act actually been committed. The last thing that we have under specific penalties is Canon 1399, which is the general norm we've already discussed, that it's not a specific crime, but it says if you violate some canon that doesn't have a penalty attached to it, you might be subject to a penalty. This is controversial for the reasons we discussed, but it has been used in recent years, at least on some limited occasions. Okay, I think that's everything for specific crimes and specific penalties. And next time we will talk more specifically about SST and perhaps about the Dallas Charter and norms as well. Thank you very much.